here's the section on hydraulics, part number 2. Okay, again, you need to make sure that for the test you can tell me the purpose and the function of each hydraulic component, and you can recognize the symbol for it when you see it in a diagram. Here's selector valves. This is one selector valve, and it shows it in 3 different positions. Let's say that we have hydraulic fluid, and we have pressure going to this direction, going in this direction, and this valve is shut. This is a piece of metal on the inside that can rotate. You've got an arm on here, and you can rotate it left and right. And right now the hydraulic fluid is blocked. However, if we rotated this valve 90 degrees to the right, then hydraulic fluid can now come in and go out to an actuator. And if it was a double acting actuator, some of the fluid would have to come back and now go to the reservoir. Or if you wanted to, you could rotate the valve from this position here. If you rotated it to the left, now the fluid would go in this direction, and fluid from coming from somewhere else could go in that direction, or the other way, going in that direction. So what you're going to find here, as I'll show you a picture here in a moment, is that if you have, this is a 3-way selector valve. It's very similar to a flap handle in a Cessna 172, in that that flap handle has 3 positions. You can make the flaps go up, you can make the flaps go down, or you can make the flaps do nothing. So here we have off, and this might be up, and this might be down. So it's very similar to an electrical switch. So a selector valve is there so you can control the operation of different components on the inside of the hydraulic system. And how does it do it? What's its function? Remember, this is the how, and this is the why. It does it by starting and stopping fluid flow. Pressure regulator is there to maintain a constant pressure, so the pressure doesn't go too high, the pressure doesn't go too low, and it does it by either sending fluid into the system or into the pump inlet. I'll show you how it works here. So let's just say here comes the fluid from the reservoir, and the fluid comes in here and it gets pushed around in this direction. Fluid gets caught in here, goes around in this direction. Now let's say the fluid's going to the actuators, but let's say that we've turned off the selector valve, so no fluid can go in here. If this engine-driven pump, if this is driven off of the engine, and the engine doesn't stop spinning, and this pump doesn't stop spinning, we're going to continue to push fluid out here to the actuators into the hydraulic system. So the pressure in here, the PSI, would go up and up and up and up, and finally something would burst, something would break. So we don't want that pressure to go too high, so we're going to have a pressure regulating valve. And it works by having a spring pushing down on this ball right here, and this ball is closing up this hole. Now, you got to remember, force equals area times pressure. The spring has a certain force pushing down. This hole down here has a certain area, and the pressure needed by this fluid in here to go against the pressure of the spring is set by the area of this hole versus the force of the spring. So at some predetermined pressure, in here, the force exerted on this ball will be high enough that it'll push the ball up. The pressure in here will go high enough that it'll push against the ball, the fluid, and it'll overcome the spring tension. The fluid will go around and come back into the pump. And what will end up occurring is on this system here, we'll have a PSI gauge, and it'll be relatively constant. A pretty typical transport category jet, big biz jet, big turboprop hydraulic system runs at 3,000 PSI. So if we turn something on and fluid goes into the system, then the pressure in here, the pressure would go down. This ball would close off, and now all of the fluid coming from the pump would go to the system, and the pressure would come back up to 3,000. So this ball is going to stay shut whenever you need fluid into the system to keep the pressure high, and the ball is going to get pushed up out of the way, and fluid's going to go past it and back around to the pump whenever the pressure starts to go a little bit above 3,000 psi. So it's going to keep the pressure at a relatively constant psi so it's going to regulate the pressure. So there it is. What does it do? Or correction, how does it work? By sending fluid to the system or sending it back to the pump. And of course, why is it on the aircraft? Is to keep a constant pressure. Now, here is a diagram of the dedicated pressure and return line system. That is, there's a pressure line that allows fluid to go from the pump out to the components in the system, and then there's a separate line that's always a return line that sends it out, sends the fluid back to the reservoir. And so here's the components we're going to look at. Here it is. Now, here's our engine-driven pump. And here's our pressure regulator. And this right here, this is our dedicated pressure line. Sorry about that. There's our pressure line. And fluids, this is going to spin. Fluid's going to enter here. It's going to go into the pressure line. And right now, of course, here's our selector valves. And right now they're in the off position, so the fluid can't go anywhere. So the pressure is going to build up here. The ball will get pushed out of the way, and fluid will go around and around in a circle, because the engine-driven pump cannot be disconnected from the engine in flight. There's no switch or lever that you can flip in the cockpit to turn it off. Sometimes they put isolation valves in here. You can turn it off right here, so you can isolate the system from the pump, but there's no way to get the pump to stop spinning. Okay, if we rotate this one, let's say we rotate this selector valve to the right, fluid's going to come up in here. It's going to fill this side of the double acting actuator. Whoops, accidentally hit a button. Yay. Running out of room there. So here's the actuators. And as the fluid fills this side up and pushes the piston over, the fluid on the opposite side of this double acting actuator is going to have to go back to the pump. So the fluid's going to go round and around in this circle. Fluid's going to come in, fill up this side of the actuator. Fluid from this side of the actuator is going to go back to the pump. So we have this pressure line. The pressure is always in. And then here, of course, we have the return line. So let's see if I got all of them. Engine-driven pump, pressure regulator, pressure line, return line, actuators, double acting, and selector valves, which in this case, they're 3-position. So this is a very basic, dedicated pressure and return line hydraulic fluid system. And this is what you're going to find in transport category jets, big jet, biz jets, and big turboprops that have flight controls that are hydraulically boosted or hydraulically actuated, and we're always going to need hydraulic fluid or hydraulic power. And so we're going to have an engine-driven pump that's running all the time the engine is running, and we're going to have hydraulic pressure and be able to displace a volume in this pressure line whenever we need to. This is the kind of system you're going to see, transport category jet, big biz jet, big turboprop. Okay, pressure gauge. What do you have? Why do you have a pressure gauge on board the airplane? So the pilot knows what's going on in the system. How well is the system operating? The function. How does it work? It works by displaying the system pressure. This part right here, you're going to see this over and over again. When you see some kind of gauge or a meter, like an ammeter, voltmeter, it's going to be the same purpose. It tells the pilot what's going on in the system. How does it do it? In this case, a pressure gauge displays the pressure in the system. I'll show you a diagram here shortly. And of course on airplanes in the United States, typically it's in PSI. And here's the diagram. I've added a few things to it. We're only going to look at one of them at a time. Here's our engine-driven pump. Here's our pressure regulator. We've got the selector valves, 3-position. We've got our double acting actuators. We have a pressure line. We have a return line. And now we're going to add a pressure gauge. And it's very typical for the pressure gauge to be mounted in the pressure line right downstream of the pump. So it's telling you the pressure of the fluid that's being supplied to the selector valves and the actuators. You're also typically going to see a system relief valve. Why is it on board the airplane? To prevent overpressurization of the hydraulic system. And how does it do it? By releasing fluid in case the pressure gets too high. So here is the pressure relief valve. The pressure relief valve is always mounted on the pressure line. And let's say that the system normally runs at 3,000 psi. If it's normally at 3,000 psi, that means that at 3001, this pressure regulator a little over 3,000 psi, this pressure regulator, the ball is going to get pushed up, and the fluid's going to go round and around a circle. But what if this gets stuck? What if this gets stuck and it won't work? And we turn off the actuators by turning the selector valves in the off position. Well, in that case, the pressure inside of the pressure line would go much, much higher than 3,000 psi, and things would start breaking. We'd have hydraulic leaks. It'd be a big mess. So this pressure relief valve over here, it's going to be set where the spring pressure is a little bit less. So this may be set to open up at, say, 3,300 psi. So if the pressure in here starts getting a little bit too high because the pressure regulator's stuck in a closed position, then when it does get up to 3,300, now the fluid can go through here. It's going to push against that spring pressure. Fluid's going to go through this line and go back all the way to the pump. We'll get to these other components here shortly. And so now effectively it's going to prevent the pressure line from overpressurizing. And 10% higher is not likely to, it's not going to have any damage to the system. Check valve. Why is a check valve found on hydraulic systems? It's there to help maintain system pressure. You notice it doesn't say regulate. It's there to keep system pressure. And how does it do it? It does it by only allowing fluid flow in one direction. I'll show you here. Here is a check valve. We've actually got two of them on this system. So there's our two check valves. I probably would have wrote it up here, because down there it's getting busy. So we have a check valve there, and we have a check valve there. And if you'll notice, the check valve is set up, so let's just say the engine-driven pump breaks and it stops spinning because it's broken. We want to keep the pressure in here so we can use it to go through the selector valves and run our actuators. But if the fluid could run through past the pump and go back to the reservoir, then the pressure in here would go down. Same thing, we'll talk about the standby pump here shortly. We want the standby pump to be able to pull fluid from the reservoir in case of an emergency, but we do not want the fluid to be able to go back through the standby pump. We only want the fluid to stay inside of the pressure line. So you can see now how the check valve maintains system pressure by only allowing fluid flow in one direction. And the nice thing about the check valve is that the arrows are shown in the direction that it does allow fluid flow. Accumulator. Why do we have an accumulator on the aircraft? It's there to provide hydraulic power in case of an emergency. How does it do it? Its function is by storing a volume of fluid at a pressure. You'll notice that these are the two things that you need to have hydraulic power. It stores a volume of a fluid so you can use it for displacement, and it stores it at a pressure so you can get a force going. And it's really good for three things, and I'll tell you about those here shortly. Here is the accumulator. Here's the accumulator. When we go out and start up the engine and the engine-driven pump starts spinning, the pressure inside of the pressure manifold, the pressure line is going to be low, so the pressure regulating valve is going to be pushed all the way shut. So all of the fluid coming out of the pump is going to fill up the pressure line. When that gets up to about 3,000 psi, the engine-driven pump will still spin, but now the fluid the pressure will push the ball out of the way. The fluid will go round and around in a circle. In the meantime, if we had compressed gas on one side of the accumulator, and it's almost always nitrogen, N2, nitrogen, and we had a diaphragm here in the middle, according to Pascal's law, if the pressure manifold is open to this half of the hydraulic accumulator, then the pressure inside the hydraulic accumulator is going to be 3,000 psi. Any pressure anywhere is going to be the same pressure everywhere. So when this is running, when the engine-driven pump is running and everything is working normally, then the pressure on the back side of here is going to have to be 300 psi of compressed gas on the other side of this diaphragm. Now let's just say that the engine-driven pump quits. We've got the check valves, fluid can't get out, but look what we're doing right here. We're storing a volume of fluid at a pressure. So that means we have hydraulic energy stored up inside of this accumulator. Now we could rotate one of these selector valves and fluid could leave the accumulator and fill up this side of the actuator. Of course, the other side of the actuator fluid would go around and go back to the reservoir. So for a little while, just like a battery in a 172, this would provide us with a small amount of power for the system for a short period of time. So that's one of the three things that a hydraulic accumulator can do, is that it provides emergency hydraulic power. Of course, it's only going to do that if we have a failure of the engine pump. Let's see if I can get rid of this other stuff here. I guess I need to get a better eraser, just like the syllabus says. Well, that's close enough. All right, next thing that an accumulator can do. Let's say that we're flying along and this actuator is turned off, or this selector valve is to the off position. This selector valve is in the off position, and so the fluid is going around in a circle here, and we're sitting at 3,000 psi. And of course, let's say we don't have an accumulator at all. Let's say all of a sudden we rotate both of these selector valves to the on position, and fluid starts leaving the pressure line. Fluid starts leaving the pressure line and filling up the actuator. Well, this valve over here, the pressure regulating valve, it doesn't move instantaneously. If fluid in here gets to move somewhere else, then the pressure in here is going to go down. Just like in your house, if you turn on a bunch of water faucets simultaneously, the water pressure inside of your house pipes is going to go down a little bit. Okay, what's going to happen is the pressure is going to go down, and if we have less pressure in here, it won't exert as much force. Remember, force equals area times pressure. So if pressure is less and area is constant, force is going to be less. So for a second or two or three, the actuators aren't going to be able to push quite as hard as they would have until the engine-driven pump stops the fluid going around a circle and pumps more fluid into the pressure line to make up for the pressure that's gone. But we're going to have a loss in pressure for a second or two, therefore we'll have a loss of force at our actuators. However, if we had an accumulator and it had fluid in here and it's storing this fluid at 3,000 psi, if we turned on a whole bunch of things all at once, if there's not enough fluid in the pressure line to provide the actuators, some of this fluid in the accumulator would be able to be used in the pressure line. And now instead of the pressure saying going down to 2,000 psi, let's say it only goes down to 2800 psi, which means the pressure will be almost as high as it normally would, so the force would be almost as high as it normally would. Let's try the reverse. Let's say that we have these things turned on, and the pressure regulator is not allowing fluid to go through there because we need fluid to run the actuators. Let's say all of a sudden we stop, we turn the selector valves to the off position, and we don't let any more fluid come into the actuators. Well, the fluid is getting pumped from the engine, driven pump, into the system, and if all of a sudden we turn these off, the pressure is going to go too high. Maybe it'll go up to 3800 psi. And maybe that's a little too high. We don't want the pressure to get that high. Well, if we had the the accumulator in here, some of this fluid coming out of the pump could go into the accumulator. Now this diaphragm would move over, and we'd have more than this half full of hydraulic fluid. But then the pressure, instead of going up to 3800, it might only go up to 3300 psi. So number 2 is it prevents low or high pressure when turning things on and off. When turning actuators on and off. It essentially keeps the pressure a lot closer to 3000, even though we turn a bunch of things on at once or we turn a bunch of things off at once. Then there is number 3. The third thing that hydraulic accumulators can do, and this is not very common, but let's just say that we hooked up right here, we had a hydraulic motor. And this hydraulic motor would start up an auxiliary power unit, a little tiny jet engine. You're going to find this in some big military helicopters. And you're also going to find this on an F-16. Anybody ever heard of an F-16? On an F-16, they don't hook this into the main hydraulic system. Same thing for this helicopters. They don't hook it into the main hydraulic system. But they have an accumulator. And I did make one error. They did have a hand pump. There's the standby pump. There is operated by hand. You can move this back and forth by hand and pump fluid into and charge up this accumulator. So you didn't have to worry about whether your battery was any good. So what you could do to start up the auxiliary power unit on these military helicopters is you would open a valve and let the fluid from the hydraulic accumulator go to the hydraulic motor, and the hydraulic motor would spin around, and that would spin the APU up and start the APU up. Literally, you would use the hydraulic motor and the hydraulic accumulator in place of a battery and an electric motor. Like in a Cessna 172, you'd have a battery to provide energy, and you'd use an electric starter to convert that electrical energy into rotating energy. Here, we're going to store hydraulic power because we have pressure and we have volume. We're going to convert that hydraulic power into rotating energy. That rotating energy, kinetic energy, can fire up the APU. Then on these military helicopters, the APU is used to start the main engine. On an F-16, instead of starting an APU, it literally starts a little tiny jet engine, and this jet engine is geared into the main engine. And that starts the main engine on the F-16. In either case, number 3, you can use it for engine starts. It's not very common on civilian aircraft, but you can use a hydraulic accumulator to provide power to spin a hydraulic motor and have that hydraulic motor start a small jet engine, because that's really what an APU is. An auxiliary power unit is a small jet engine. Reservoir. Why is it on the airplane? To provide extra fluid. And how does it work? It works by storing fluid and waits for you to pull it out. So here is the reservoir. Get rid of that stuff. Okay, here's the reservoir. Generally speaking, when you have a dedicated pressure and return line system, you're going to have that engine-driven pump, you're going to have all these other components, and you're going to have the reservoir. You'll notice here's the fluid level. So here's the fluid. You'll notice the fluid comes out of the reservoir and goes to the engine-driven pump. I have seen some systems where the pressure relief, or correction, the pressure regulating valve sends the fluid back to the reservoir, but still, we'd still be running the fluid in a circle. The reservoir is needed to provide extra fluid for more than one reason. First of all, if we have a leak, if we have drip, 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 after a while, the reservoir level is going to go down, so we need some extra fluid. The second thing is when hydraulic fluid gets hot, it expands. So you're always going to see some air in on the top of the reservoir. So in case the fluid expands and gets bigger, there's still some space. So we need to have a reservoir to allow for fluid expansion and for fluid leaks. Standpipe. Why is it on the aircraft? To allow operation after we have a large fluid loss. I'll show you that here in a second. How does it work? By preventing a loss of all fluid. And so here I'll show you the standpipe. Here's the standpipe right here. So let's, there we go. That's the standpipe. You'll notice the standpipe is above the bottom of the reservoir. Let's say we had a really, really bad leak right here. Let's say fluid was leaking out like crazy. If we turned this selector valve to the off position and no more fluid could get out and we stopped the leak, if the fluid level had gone all the way down to here, yeah, I guess I erased it. Now you can't see what's going on at the standpipe. There we go. If the fluid level had come all the way down to the top of the standpipe, we wouldn't have any fluids to get sucked in for the engine-driven pump to operate the other actuators. But you'll notice that this standby pump here it's pulling fluid in from the absolute very bottom of the reservoir. So the reason that the standpipe is higher than the bottom is that if you have a big ol' honkin' leak, if you can isolate it, now a standby pump will still have some fluid to operate the other components. So the standby pump, let's say it's electric, so it's spinning around, 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 and it pumps this fluid into the pressure line system. We turn on this, rotate this selector valve, fluid comes into this side closes over. Here we have this fluid goes around to the filter and comes back into the reservoir. So it'll still work. Maybe not as good as it would have otherwise, but hopefully it'll still work. So having a standpipe is a good thing. And hopefully standby pump is the next one. Yay! Why do we have it on the aircraft? What's its purpose? Is to provide hydraulic power. Wow. Provide hydraulic power, but only use it typically when the main engine pump fails. And of course, it's a power conversion, or correction, an energy conversion device. You'll notice this part right here, the function of a standby pump, how does it do it? And the function of an engine-driven pump is identical. It changes kinetic energy or rotating energy into hydraulic power. So here's our standby pump. I already told you what that was. And on big aircraft like this that have a dedicated engine-driven pump and flight controls that are powered by hydraulics, this is going to be electric. It's not going to be manually operated. But on smaller airplanes, for instance, on a Cessna 182RG, a retractable geared 182, and the standby pump is a hand-operated pump, and you actually have to move it back and forth by hand. Okay, thermal relief valve. Why is it on the airplane? What's its purpose? It prevents overpressurization. And how does it work? It releases fluid. So here, I'll show you the thermal relief valves. So let's try writing them in here. Thermal relief valve. And this one shows two of them. There's one right here, and there's one right there. Let's say that we park the airplane and these selector valves are in their current position and this is off. So no fluid can come here, go through there, no fluid can go through there, none can go through here, none can go through here. Well, just because hydraulic fluid is not compressible does not mean that it can't expand and contract with temperature. Let's say that it starts expanding because it's sitting on a hot ramp on a hot day in the desert. So the fluid in here starts to expand. The pressure is going to get higher and higher. If it can't get out here, it can't go past this O-ring, can't go past the O-ring there either. It's going to get higher and higher, and the pressure is going to go much higher than the 3,000 psi or whatever it's set for. So it's going to start blowing things. It's going to cause leaks. Connections are going to pop. Fuel or hydraulic fluid is going to leak out. So to prevent that, this thermal relief valve is down here. It's really just a miniature pressure relief valve. Works off of the same thing. It's probably going to be set to say maybe 3,500 psi. And so if the pressure in here gets too high, just one little drop of fluid is going to go past this ball, push it out of the way, and go back to the reservoir. Just one little tiny drop would be enough for this pressure to drop dramatically. Now, although this valve here is operated off of pressure, it's called a thermal relief valve because it saves the system because of the temperature of the hydraulic fluid getting hot and that causing the high pressure. Filter. Why is a filter on board a hydraulic system? That is what its purpose. It's there to increase the reliability of the system. It won't break as often. How does it do it? What's its function? It does it by cleaning the fluid. So in this system, we pump fluid in on the pressure side, and after fluid leaves the actuators, it goes through the filter on its way back to the reservoir. Now you could put a filter in here. You could put a filter in a lot of places. In cars, they usually put the engine oil filter right after the pump. But in a hydraulic system, most of this fluid here is getting pushed back to the reservoir, so it's pretty easy to push fluid through a filter. It takes the things out, just like in a car or a small airplane piston engine oil system for the engine. It takes little tiny pieces of metal out so you don't keep circulating the chunks of metal inside and wearing things out. So it'll last longer, won't break as often, it's more reliable. Hydraulic fuse. Why do you put a hydraulic fuse on an airplane? It's there. Its purpose is to prevent large losses of fluid. It doesn't prevent small leaks from occurring. And how does it work? What's its function? It'll turn off a fluid line in case of a very, very large loss of fluid. And it's automatic. You don't have, the pilot doesn't control it. In fact, you don't even see it. Here is a picture of the inside of a hydraulic fuse. Now, you don't have to draw this on the test. I'm not going to show you this on the test, so I'll go through it really fast. These black dots up here and the black dot down here, that's really a spring in here, and it's pushing this direction. It's pushing this plate over. It's pushing this plate over. Now, here's fluid coming from the pump and fluid going out to the actuators and selector valves. Now, the pressure in here is really, really close to 3,000 psi, and the pressure in here is 3,000 psi. So the pressure on one side of this plate is 3,000. The pressure on the other side of the plate is 3,000. But oh wait, here's this spring, so that overcomes the equilibrium and pushes this plate over. So now the only way the fluid can go is through this hole right here and this hole right here, and it works out just fine. Slows the fluid down a little bit, but it's not too bad. Now, if this fluid coming out towards the actuator was, if there was a big giant hole in the fluid line and it leaked out a whole bunch, then the pressure in here would be a whole lot less than 3,000 psi. It might be down to 1,000 psi. Of course, on this side, it's 3,000 psi coming from the pump. So now the pressure on this side of the plate is a lot higher than the pressure on this side, so it's going to push the plate over. It's actually going to overcome this spring pressure, and it's going to push this plate over, and now the fluid can't go anymore. So downstream, you won't have a leak anymore, but also, unfortunately, downstream, nothing there will work. However, everything upstream on the pressure line, everything upstream is still going to operate. So if you were going to pump all your fluid overboard anyway, nothing would work either downstream or upstream. So it's kind of nice to have hydraulic fuses in hydraulic systems. So you might want to find out if your airplane on your aircraft has hydraulic flues. So what's, for instance, if we put a hydraulic fuse right here, if we had a leak right here and this closed it off, this actuator and this selector valve wouldn't work anymore, but this one would still be good. I'll take 1 over 0 anytime. Isolation valve, I mentioned that earlier. Why do we have it on an airplane? What's its purpose? Is to control where the fluid's going to go. And how does it do it? What's its function? It'll either allow or stop fluid flow. These are generally controlled by the pilot or the computer. And as I suggested before, whoops, I think I need to show you a picture. Not of the inside, but a diagram. I think I can get me one here. Ta-da! Here would be a good place to put an isolation valve, would be right here. Now you could isolate the pump from the rest of the system. You could also put an isolation valve right here. You could rotate it and let fluid go through, or you could rotate it back and turn it off. So when you get in those transport category jets, big biz jets, big turboprops, you're going to be seeing that there are some isolation valves in the system. Pressure reducer. Why do you have a pressure reducer in a hydraulic system? What's its purpose? It allows you to put in different components into the aircraft that run on different pressures without having to have separate pumps to run at different PSIs. Well, how does it do its job? What's its function? Is it reduces or steps down the system pressure, say from 3,000 down to say 500 PSI. So you could put a pressure reducer in here. And then the output, even though the system might be 3,000 PSI, the output might be 500 PSI. That way you still only need pumps on the aircraft that run at 3,000 PSI that run most everything else on the aircraft, and you don't have to bolt a separate pump to the engine. You can just have a pressure reducer, and we're not going to go into how it works. Hey, we're pilots. And you might run things like windshield wipers, something that doesn't need, literally hydraulic-powered windshield wipers, something that doesn't need 3,000 PSI. Seals and O-rings. What is the purpose? Why are they there on the aircraft? To prevent a loss of fluid. And how do they work? What's their function? By filling the space between metal parts. Here is a diagram, you've seen it before, of a double-acting actuator. You can see the O-rings here, goes all the way around, and there's O-ring here, goes all the way around. If we pump fluid into this side of the actuator, the fluid can't go past the O-ring. The fluid cannot go past the O-ring. So now all that fluid is going to get displaced and push this piston over. Same thing if the fluid gets pumped into this direction. The fluid can't go past this O-ring. It can't go past this O-ring, and it can't go past this one, and it can't go past this one. So it keeps the fluid from leaking out. Let's say you had a Cessna 172 shock strut. We're all familiar with Cessna 172s. So that nose wheel shock strut, it goes up and down. You're looking in right here. It's chrome plated so it doesn't rust. And there's hydraulic fluid in here. And the hydraulic fluid would tend to leak out. So they put a V-shaped seal in here so that as the shock strut goes down, it scrapes the fluid off and keeps it inside of the shock strut. So a seal or a O-ring does the same thing. Fluid cooling. Problem is with hydraulic systems is that they generate heat. Some of the energy that's taken off of the engine is not converted into hydraulic energy at the pump. Some of it's converted into heat. Although it's lubricated, there is some friction. So the two places you're going to get heat, the number one place is going to be the pump, and the number two place is going to be the actuator. But since the pump is supplying power to all the actuators, it's concentrated there. So usually the pump gets the hottest. But it's going to heat up the fluid, so we're going to have to do something about cooling the fluid. You can have a fluid air heat exchanger. This is just like a radiator in the front of your car. You pump fluid through the engine. The fluid gets hot. You pump it out to the front of the car, and you blow outside air across it, which works out fine. The car has to get pushed through the air anyway. It does cause a little drag. Well, on an airplane, sticking a radiator out there, a heat exchanger out into the airstream is going to cause some drag, but it'll work. A second way to do that is to run it through the fuel tank. Here I got a picture. Let's say that here is the fuel tank. Really, well, here's a better picture. Let's take a transport category jet wing. And on transport category jets, the wing skin is the fuel tank. So there's fuel in here. Let's see, let's make it straw colored. So here's the fuel. So here's the fuel inside of the fuel tank. What you can do is, you'll notice here, make it blue. You notice here on its way, on the fluid's way back to the reservoir, instead of running it just through the filter, you can run it through either a fluid air heat exchanger and stick the wind outside and have air blow through it, or you could put this tubing inside the bottom of the fuel tank. So if we looked at it from the top, it would look like this right here. But if we looked at it from the side, all the tubing is on the bottom of the fuel tank. So even if the fuel is low, we're still going to slosh fuel across the hydraulic fluid. Now it's going to warm the fuel up, but if you take AS311 turbines, you'll find out that warming the fuel is okay. It prevents water inside of the fuel from freezing into ice particles and clogging filters and stuff like that. So it's actually good to warm up the fuel. And this way the heat energy leaves the hydraulic fluid gets cooler. So this is a very common method in transport category jets, big biz jets, and big turboprops to cool the fluid, cool the hydraulic fluid down by running the fluid through the fuel tank. Okay, there's a lot of ways to get backup hydraulic power or emergency backup power. Of course, if you've already got an engine-driven pump, you could put a second one on another engine. You could put a second pump on the same engine. Of course, we already discussed that in a System 182 RG with retractable gear that you could have a manually powered hand pump to supply a backup hydraulic power in case the primary hydraulic pump fails. In transport category jets, big biz jets, big turboprops that power the flight controls with the hydraulic system, you're not going to be able to produce enough power, pressure, or volume with one or two people running a hand pump. You're going to have backup electrical pumps. Backup electrical pumps in case the main engine-driven pumps quit. You could also have a pneumatically powered. If you, say, had a turbine, you could bleed air off of the engine, and the turbine could run a hydraulic pump. The demand pumps on the Boeing 777, the demand pumps are set up so that if the engine-driven pumps, the main ones, don't produce enough hydraulic fluid, these will kick in automatically. The computer will let some bleed air off of the engine and blow across the turbine and spin the pump around. And then, of course, my personal favorite is RAT. RAT stands for Ram Air Turbine. And I got a couple of pictures here. You pull a handle. You'll notice if you've taken a turbine class or looked up the tailpipe of a jet engine, this looks just like turbine blades. Oh, wait, they are turbine blades. They're designed to extract energy. They're not a propeller or a fan that adds energy to air. This extracts it, so air goes through it and spins it, and in the back here is a hydraulic pump. You could also make it an electrical generator. Again, here's another RAT. You notice these blades are curved in the opposite direction because they're designed to extract energy, not to add energy. So this is a RAT. These blades spin around, extract energy, and spin the hydraulic pump. And I think I got one more. Here we go. Here's a RAT out of an Airbus. I don't remember which model it is, but there's a hydraulic pump in here somewhere. And the air blows across these blades. The blades spin. Hydraulic fluid comes in, gets pumped out at a high pressure. And on a lot of airplanes that are electronically controlled flight controls, digital fly-by-wire, we're also going to use a RAT to drive an electrical generator. So if you had full electrical failure and full hydraulic failure, you'd still be able to operate the primary flight controls at least a little bit. Then, of course, there's the power transfer unit. Power transfer unit It's also called the power takeoff unit because it's taking power off of one hydraulic system and sending it into another system. Here is a diagram of a power transfer unit. Let's just say that we have, here's a hydraulic pump. It's pulling fluid in from the reservoir, and this here is the pressure line for one system. Let's just say, and here's that's system A. Here's system B. Here's this pump. It pulls fluid in from its reservoir, and here's the pressure line in system B. So we're flying along, and the pump quits. If the pump quits, then the pressure inside the pressure line is going to go down. What you can do is flip a switch in the cockpit. It opens a valve, and it allows the pressurized fluid to go into this device right here, and this is a hydraulic motor. It's the opposite of a hydraulic pump. It converts hydraulic power and turns it into rotational energy, and it rotates a metal shaft. When the fluid goes through it, it goes back to its own reservoir. So the fluid in system in system B goes around and around, and of course some of the fluid powers the other components in system B, but some of this energy that the pump is converting out of the engine gets used to run this hydraulic motor, and here's a metal shaft. It's not hollow, and it spins a hydraulic pump. This hydraulic pump is hooked up to the reservoir in system A. It pulls in fluid from the reservoir in system A and pumps it into the pressure line. Now this hydraulic pump is set up, it's not nearly as big as the main pump for that system, but hey, I'd rather have a little bit of fluid at a pressure than no fluid at no pressure at all. And so of course here you can see this makes up the power takeoff unit, the power transfer unit. You could also flip the switch in the other direction, because the inside of a hydraulic motor and the inside of a hydraulic pump is the same. So if system B pump failed, you could actually take fluid from system A, run this hydraulic pump. Of course, it would go back to its own reservoir, and power, only power, no fluid, would go from one system to the other. It would spin this hydraulic motor, and it would be pulling fluid from its hydraulic reservoir and pumping it to the system. So there's no transfer of hydraulic fluid. I've not seen an airplane where you could pump fluid from one system to the other, but you can take power off of one system and put it into another. Several gauges. Of course, we already talked about the pressure gauge. Quantity gauges, it's not uncommon. In fact, it's extremely common. The bigger the airplane, the more likely is that you're going to have an in-flight indication of fluid quantity. Whoops, I guess there ought to be an L in there. Fluid quantity in the reservoir. That's a pretty common gauge to have. You're also very commonly going to have a temperature gauge of the fluid. And so those are the things you're going to monitor. What do you get to do about it? Well, you got to have controls. Of course, we've already covered selector valves. You can make actuators operate. Talked about isolation valves. You can turn off one part of the system to the other. This is really a pump valve is really a specialized isolation valve. You could isolate the pump from the rest of the system. You could turn on and off standby pumps, which we've already looked at that, and you could pull the handle and start the rat. So there are several things you can do in a hydraulic system in case of a workaround procedure, and we've already looked at that enough. Okay, if you got any questions or improvements,